Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. I'm really happy to be speaking with Dr. Matthew Bodie. He's got a book coming out in September. It is called The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. So welcome, Matthew, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
I'm happy to be here.
So yeah, you contacted me on X. I won't say Twitter, but I'll say X the other day. Sure. And when I saw your comment, I thought, man, I've got to talk to Matthew, because obviously I've done lots and lots of episodes on Dominion theology, Christian nationalism, Christian reconstructionism, Seven Mountains Mandate. So I thought this is right up my street. So I'm really glad that you're coming out with this book. So what was the sort of impetus? Why did you write this particular book?
I've been writing and researching Turning Point USA, the group that's featured in the book, since about 2018. And then in 2020, they switched from a sort of a secular libertarian point of view to a Christian nationalism, Christian dominion point of view. Charlie Kirk changed, did a 180 on these issues. And so he, since that time, has really focused his organization, which is massive in the United States, to these 7 areas of cultural influence. So the impetus for the book became the growing power of Turning Point, and then combine that with the growing power of the Seven Mountains Mandate as a form of Christian nationalism. And that became my lane. And so, I wrote the book about Turning Point because there hasn't really been a book about Charlie Kirk and what he's done and what he's going to do. There's been several books about Christian nationalism, but the Seven Mountain Mandate is really the thing that he's taken hold of and made it his own. So that's really the impetus for the book.
So what's your own backstory? Did you come out of religion at all? Are you still in any way, shape, or form religious yourself? What's your background?
I definitely would call myself a Christian. I don't know if I would use the word evangelical. I was telling someone else about this. Like I recognized the importance of what Charlie Kirk was doing and what he was saying about the Seven Mountains Mandate, because I had heard terms like theocracy and Christian dominionism as far back as the 1990s. When I heard him talking these things, I recognized it immediately. I didn't necessarily grow up in those communities, but I was adjacent to it in growing up in evangelicalism in America. So I knew what those things were. And I knew that they were very marginal and very on the fringes. But then if you say became mainstream beyond those things, that's really what hit me. I'm 45, so it's been several years since I heard those terms, but at the same time, I recognize them from being an American in the 90s and the 2000s. If you grew up in, especially white evangelicalism, you did that. So I would say that I've been around to many churches in many places in many denominations, but obviously all Christian.
It's interesting. There's a number of Christians who are speaking out, because I just finished reading a book. I don't know if you've come across it, by Andrew Whitehead. Of course, he co-wrote the book, Taking America Back for God with Sam Perry. I had them on the show a couple years ago, and I've interviewed Andrew by himself. And I picked up this book the other day. It was about a month or two ago. And it was something like, I don't remember the exact title, but it was something about the idolatry of Christian nationalism. I don't know if you've come across it, but I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. And I know Andrew. Yeah, I read the book, but I didn't realize that he was an evangelical. He was speaking out, but he was speaking out against Christian nationalism. So like Christians against Christian nationalism. And I was kind of surprised by that, because I thought, oh, right, okay. I was kind of taken off guard, and he quotes a lot of Bible verses and, tries to debunk Christian nationalism from a Christian point of view. Is that what you're trying to do in the book here, or are you just laying out the facts, as it were?
I think I'm doing both. I think there is a push, especially with the subtitle of Destroying Democracy, to return us to a democratic religious pluralism that Christian nationalism is against. And so part of each chapter is how to respond to what we see in the different mountains. And so I'm interested in keeping a democracy with a religious pluralism. And so I think that's one of the goals of the book. I come at that from a religious liberty perspective. That is, I want religious liberty for everyone. Part of the effort is as a Christian, is to suggest that they're both harming Christianity and its evangelism ideas, but also harming the nation.
Yeah, this is a very similar premise to Andrew Whitehead's book, what you're talking about. Well, let's go back to the beginning. Okay, some of the people that are listening, because if they've been listening to my show, they've heard the concept of Seven Mountains Mandate or Dominion theology. Where does that concept come from? Because obviously Charlie Kirk didn't originate the Seven Mountains Mandate. He's picked it up, as you say, and adopted the model for Turning Point USA, Turning Point Faith, and all that. Where does this idea come from? How far back does it actually go?
The idea that there are 7 areas of cultural influence that Christians want to take over seems to be originated in the 70s with people like Bill Bright and Lauren Cunningham, who ran youth-oriented groups, Campus Crusade and Lauren's group, Youth with a Mission. And those two people had a vision of this list of these 7 areas. They didn't call them mountains, called them areas of influence. And during the 70s, the mid-70s, they met in 1975, had this list. Now, around that time, there was other people doing similar things. One of the also fathers of American Christian dominionism, Peter Wagner, started around the late 70s doing the same thing, talking about culture war and talking about being a person or having Christians take over institutions and not just interested in individual evangelism. So around the 70s, mid 70s, late 70s, that happened. Of course, Wagner started the charismatic part of that, the new apostolic reformation. And as you mentioned before, R.J. Rushdoony is more of the reformed, we'll call him that, thing. And he's been around since the 60s. And he's written many things that Cunningham and Bright and Francis Schaeffer all implicitly or explicitly quote at times. So there is a, soup of people, if you will, around that time that come up with this list of these 7 areas. And this, of course, dates back. It has reference to Abraham Kuyper across the pond and the spheres of influence. I don't think he specifically named 7, but he said that these are areas in which the church and Christians should have great influence. And he would use the word influence, whereas perhaps Bill Bright and Lauren Cunningham and Peter Wagner would use the word dominion. So as these ideas have grown and come across people, they, if you will, strengthened their call to divine impact so that we now have a mandate and not just a list of 7 areas. Of course, the final person I want to mention is Lance Wallnau. He met Lauren Cunningham in 2000 and heard about this list or this vision, and then met Peter Wagner. And from there, it took a couple of years, but the metaphor of the mountains took hold. And by the time that Peter Wagner died in 2016, it was clear that this was the metaphor and this was the list. And since then, really, Lance Wallnau has been the face of that. And now he's called Charlie Kirk the new face of the 7 Mountains Mandate of Christian nationalism.
So Lance Wallnau's passing the torch along to Charlie Kirk. He's the new Seven Mountains guy. Because I can remember I've done a lot of research into Lance Wallnau. I've never actually done an episode on him specifically, or even Charlie Kirk, but I've listened to a lot of his things on YouTube. He posts on Facebook and rants all over the place. But yeah, here was a guy during the first Trump administration who was holding basically Bible studies, in Congress, White House, to senators, congressmen, and women, talking about the Seven Mountains Mandate. I can remember seeing him. He's got this whiteboard. He's sketching out the mountains, and it's all scrawled all over the place. I think,
yeah.
How in the hell does a guy like Lance Wallnau get access to those corridors of power in the first place? How did he get in there? Because obviously Trump embraced this evangelical advisory board. He had to have heavy connections to get that far, surely.
Yeah. And I think that first group of evangelical advisors, Paula White Cain being one of them, a guy named Jensen Franklin, who is a pastor here in Georgia, was on that original list. He is hosting Charlie Kirk and Lance Wallnau tomorrow at the Turning Point Pastor Summit, which I'm attending. And there's other people involved with the Seven Mountains Mandate that will also be there. But you can see that cross pollination of people from Lance Wallnau to Charlie Kirk at a pastor summit. And so I think that how Lance did it is the same way in which how Charlie, they're very charismatic. They're very good at talking to people. They're very good at selling their own ideas and selling their organization. And so they just, I wouldn't say happen to be in the right place at the right time, but they know what they're doing in terms of saying the right things to the right people.
It seems like that's the case. I read recently Matthew Taylor's book. I don't know if you've read that, The Violent Take It by Force. Very good book. And the story that he told, he was on the podcast just before the end of last year, just before it was like right before the election, I think, or right around the time of the election. And we talked a lot about that. And basically that was the story that he told. And what I found interesting about going through his book, like you said, this confluence, so Peter Wagner meets Cindy Jacobs just sort of like on a happenstance sort of meet thing. They go to lunch or something like that, or he gives her a ride to the airport somewhere after a conference, and they just get to talking, and she gets all fired up about his ideas, and he gets fired up about her ideas, and then the association begins, the networking begins. What about Cindy Jacobs? Because this is another person that doesn't come up a lot. Maybe people don't know who she is. Did you come across her in your research?
Yeah, she certainly plays a role in terms of these networks and creating these things. Of course, as you know, in American charismatic land, these figures, right? These people with big brands, if you will, they create these audiences or these platforms that is, if you get connected to them, you're connected to all these people. So forming a network with these people is very powerful. I tried to write in the book about I don't know. There's obviously a dividing line, a theological dividing line between women pastors and non-women or non-allowing women pastors. Sure. And so I think that in terms of the Seven Mountains mandate, there are plenty of female preachers, if you will, that promote this. But at the same time, there are groups that don't want to promote that idea, like Charlie Kirk, who have kind of just not been interested in that debate. And so there are no female pastors per se at the pastor summit tomorrow, but they do have female speakers. I guess what I'm getting at is that there's a host of different theological lines that are being crossed here that have not necessarily been crossed before, that are working together toward, having the mountains become successful.
This is it. There's a cross-pollination, isn't it? Like the confluence, because I remember hearing the idea that a lot of this initially comes more out of this charismatic movement, as you say. That's where a lot of the original Seven Mountains stuff comes out of. And you see people like Cindy Jacobs and Paula White Cain. These are women who would never be allowed to be pastors in most typical. Doug Wilson, for example, he's kind of a dominionist, sort of a Christian Reconstructionist up there in Moscow, Idaho.
Right.
He's definitely a Christian patriarchalist, biblical patriarch. He's not going to allow a woman to be a pastor or an elder, but yet they're kind of running in these same circles in a way. Maybe they're not best mates or anything, but there's this cross-pollination. I remember reading a couple years ago, someone from the Family Research Council talking about the Seven Mountains of culture. And I thought, now here's an interesting thing. Why is a very conservative organization like Family Research Council, associated with Dr. James Dobson, focused on the family and all that, they're using that language.
Yeah.
How has that become sort of the lingua franca of a lot of evangelicals, regardless of theological background? They're using that language, it seems.
Oh, no, totally. And I think that it's just an easy metaphor to use. I mean, I think they struggled with the actual image. Some of them call pillars, some of them call gates. They started out with areas, but the mountain seems to be the most visual, easiest to say or to teach, if you will. And so then the 7 areas, whether they're 7 or it doesn't really matter with the number, but I'm saying that these areas, naming these areas, become very clear to people. Oh, yes, outside the church, these are the ways in which we should influence people. And I think that the groups that are not necessarily charismatic, like the Southern Baptist Convention, has also taken up this language. And it's easier for people to do that, especially to show that you're doing it to help out with your friends in the charismatic world, but also that it's an easy metaphor, it's an easy list to know, and it gives you a strategy, it gives you an action point to say with your people, hey, if you're not a minister, these are the ways that which you can help us. And I think that growing up in evangelical world, it wasn't always clear, become a Christian, you were converted, and then you were just to live your life, right? But now with these 7 areas, you can be part of this change, or your spear, which I kind of heard about, as a young adult, but at the same time, it was like you chose one. But now they're putting them all together and saying, we want to change the nation. And I think that that's really the key. It's not just about individual lives or perhaps even community lives. It is about changing institutions before you have mass evangelism. They're not talking about having thousands of Christians take over the government. They're talking about minority of Christians taking over the government and ruling it from a Christian perspective. So it's about changing institutions first and not individuals.
And it seems to me like it is a brilliant mobilization strategy. As you say, the average evangelical sitting in that pew in any town, USA, or anywhere in the world for that matter, not just an American thing, that is such a brilliant strategy. They could say to that person, look, you're not going to run for president. You're never going to do that. That's not what this is about. You might not even run for mayor of your city or town or whatever, but you can run for your school board. You can take over that education mountain. You can take over that business mountain. Are you a businessman, businesswoman? You can start taking over, even if it's a small mountain in your local area. And that's how you start to take dominion. It's a mobilization strategy whereby the average Christian can say to themselves, well, yeah, I'm not going to run for president, but I can do X, Y, Z, and begin to take dominion. Do you find that that language is what's being used? I mean, I'm interested, I should touch base with you after you go to this pastor's conference to see what kind of rhetoric, because it's,
No, they will use that phrase. Yeah. They
yeah,
will use
they're gonna
that
be
phrase.
there. It seems like I'm probably gonna predict that what they're gonna be told, these pastors, is when you go back to your home church, this is what you need to be telling your people. Is that what you're expecting to hear?
Yeah, this is probably the fourth or fifth pastor summit that Turning Point has had, and so they've obviously, being a Christian national organization, has promoted. They had I forget how to pronounce his name. They had Shay on
Yeah,
on
and
the summit
Harvest Rock
weeks
Church.
ago, right? Yeah, so they're heavily promoting this idea. So they hoping to get new people come in. Obviously, they're having in Georgia for the first time, so they're having to get pastors in Georgia from around the Southeast, which is not usually their audience. And so they might not use the word dominion, but I think they will definitely talk about retaking America or making America Christian again, if you want to use that language. But really, they're interested in having both the pastors and the congregants do the same thing. So not just influencing the pastors to persuade the congregants, but also having the congregants do their thing. And really, if you think about it, putting the congregants putting the pressure on the pastor to speak more politically, and then the other way in the street, having the pastor put the pressure on the congregants to act more politically. In terms of taking dominion, it is interesting to see the areas that they start out with. They obviously start out with government and education because you can run for those offices and you can influence those things pretty easily. But like, just say the mountain of business, they are promoting an idea of capitalism and entrepreneurship, and not just for starting your own business, but in some manners, it's a prosperity gospel kind of thing that if you do certain things, you will become rich. And I think that has been a very powerful sermon topic in many churches, especially African-American churches, for some time now. So the Seven Mountains Mandate is really taking from other places. And I think that's what Charlie Kirk is really good at, is translating what he wants people to hear into the language that they have already heard, or that where they're coming from. It may be something new to them, but he's able to put it in language that they already are comfortable with to make them pursue it more. And I think that's what the Seven Mountains Mandate is for him. He doesn't use that phrase, but he talks about these 7 areas, and he talks about what people can do, and he's clearly pushing that mandate. He might not just use the phrase.
Right. He's embraced that model and tweaked it a little bit. That's the genius. I wanted to mention too, you talked about Dr. C. Peter Wagner. If you could, I'd like to go back and talk about him, because I came across him when I was in seminary in Portland in sort of late 90s, early 2000s. And we were studying church growth movement. Of course, he's a big figure in the church growth movement.
Yeah.
Out of Fuller Seminary in California, I think it was. And his association with John Wimber, the Vineyard Church denomination. We studied the Holy Laughter thing, the Toronto Blessing, watching videos on this. But this was before, I think, the New Apostolic Reformation, or maybe around that same time when it's starting to take off. How important was C. Peter Wagner in getting this off the ground? You mentioned the NAR, because one thing that struck me when I read Matthew's book, how big of a worldwide movement this is. This isn't just an American thing. They've got these prayer conferences and apostolic organizations worldwide. So how big, and C. Peter Wagner played a huge role in that, didn't he?
Right, yeah, he was a big in South America, I think Brazil, for a while, and kind of introduced these concepts, or found them there. It's kind of unclear about what that, but he studied churches there that did this sort of thing. And Matthew Taylor's book is really good about the NAR and its global ambitions. And I think that from what I read about Peter Wagner, he was sort of a reformed kind of Presbyterian person and became charismatic. And one of the great stories that I remember was he went to these conferences with these people, kind of seeing how it worked. He framed himself as an academic, like, I'm just going to go observe these people and I'll write about them. And then he became one of them, if you will. But he told this story, and I forget which particular charismatic person, but he went to one of their conferences and there was a prayer about, being rich and being wealthy, and specifically rebuking the spirit of poverty. And so much that when the people around him heard that he didn't believe in this, or that he wasn't quite sure about it, they stuffed his pockets with cash. He left that evening with hundreds of dollars in cash and took his wife out to dinner or whatever. And that was his sign that I needed to rebuke the spirit of poverty in my life. And I think that is the simple message of the mountain of business. You don't have to start a business. You just have to rebuke the spirit of poverty in life, to wish that you could have these riches, or wish or hope in God's prayer that you could do these things. And I think that is a profound, powerful message to many who are poor, and especially in poor countries in South America, especially in Africa. Those things very much resonate. The other thing about Peter Wagner with the church growth movement, you read his early books about church growth. As an academic, I can see the beginnings of an academic area or unit or research agenda, if you will, in the early books with John Wimber. They would teach these classes and they would write these books and they would have these journals. And so they were starting an academic movement around this idea of church growth. And I think what moved him, Peter Wagner, from the church growth movement into the NAR was the idea that the things they were doing in church growth weren't working. You could have rallies and you could have evangelism efforts, but really the thing that turned for him was the spiritual warfare. That you had to see the fight for your community against demons and spirits, and he called them territorial spirits borrowed from somebody else, that had taken over the areas, the influential areas of your town that you wanted to evangelize, and you had to rebuke or erase or send away those demons before anything would work. And I think that gave him, I don't know, another book, but it gave him a formula to be into church growth. Church growth happens not because of programs or buildings or great preachers. It happens because of you are investing people into a spiritual war.
I was just going to ask you about that. So I'm glad you brought that whole thing of spiritual warfare up, because if I read Rushdoony, he's not using that kind of language at all. He's not talking about rebuking territorial demons and he talks about taking dominion, but his strategy is a completely different model, a completely different way, homeschooling and raising up generations of kids and all that. But now going back to this issue of spiritual warfare, how does that exactly work? Because as I've studied the Seven Mountains Mandate, okay, let's say you're at the foot of the mountain, so to speak. It's a metaphorical mountain, but you can't just walk up that mountain as a word. It struck me as like almost a video game. Make a great video game. You could ascend the mountain, but as you're going up, you've got demons, you've got things you've got to fight and battle, but you aren't empowered necessarily to embattle those things on your own. You need an apostle, you need a general. How does that all work? Because this brings in the apostolic element of it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You need someone like a Cindy Jacobs or a Lance Walna, who is a quote unquote apostle. They've got somehow more power or something than the average person. How does that work exactly?
I think the best way to answer that is a guy I wrote about in the book. His name is Bill Hammond, and he was one of the original people that did this apostolic ministry, and Wagner read a bunch of his books. And so really it started out with, that you would have a blessing upon your life and you would speak truth or speak blessing into people's lives, that you would prophesize that they would become XYZ, or they would, God would bless them in a certain way. When that happened, you were confirmed as a great apostle or prophet. And then his visions became bigger. It wasn't just about individuals. It was about communities and nations. And other people were doing this kind of thing too. But really it was about, we want to see God take over this city. And I think that around the late 80s, there was a book by John Dawson about rebuilding or taking over cities. And he was a Lauren Cunningham student. And then Peter Wagner reads that book and talks about the territorial spirits. So the apostles would, in some manners, be the powerful visionary. And that's really often what evangelicals describe as apostles in the first century. They might not see them today, but they saw them as visionaries of seeing where the church could go and what the church could do. There are some, evangelical churches that will talk about prophets today, and being prophetic in your preaching, which is sort of the same thing as being an apostle. They are differences, but the idea that you would speak into the future, that you call the future into being, that you would say that this is going to happen. I think that is primarily the power of the NAR. They keep saying these things are going to happen. And there are events or things that happen that help them along. Obviously, people predicted, they're saying that Trump would win the presidency there. And then when he lost, they had to go back and try to justify this. But there are also things that they predict that sort of come true. And I try to trace one or two of them, like where did they get this idea from, that there would be this XYZ happening. And you can read headlines in newspapers around that time, or you can read books that are published and you can see this cross-pollinations, and they take their own idea of it and say, this thing is going to happen.
I was going to say, I did a lot of episodes, the election, run up to the 2020 election. I remember talking about that a lot because I was tracking a lot of those NAR apostles and prophets that were prophesying that Trump was going to win by a landslide. And then, of course, he lost to Joe Biden. And it was interesting to watch them pivot and twist in the wind and say, okay, God told me straight up that Trump was going to win. So what does that mean? Am I a false prophet? What's going on here? And some people actually spoke out and said, yeah, I got it wrong. And then they were lambasted, But a lot of them, what I found is they said, actually, we were right. Trump did win, but of course it was stolen from him, the big lie. So they could take refuge in that sort of dodge and say, well, but we were right. And actually, God was correct that Christians didn't do enough, apparently, spiritual warfare or whatever, to turn the tide. So actually, we weren't wrong. God wasn't wrong, but the election was stolen. Yes, I thought that was an interesting twist to get around it.
I write about in my book a guy, youth pastor in Florida. His name is just escaping me at the moment. I'll come up with it in a minute. But he went to D.C. for the insurrection. He was in the Capitol building and was arrested and sentenced to prison. And of course, was part of the pardons that Trump issued in his first day in office. And I tracked his Facebook post before he went to prison and wrote about him in the book because he went on the idea that the election was stolen. And when it didn't work, when Trump was not the president, he really tried to, turn from it, but at the same time, keep it. He is a disciple of Andrew Womack out of Colorado, another Seven Mountains Christian guy, went to his college. And he, after that, said, I don't want to follow individuals anymore. Right. So he was clearly influenced by individuals. And he said, I just want to follow God. I want to follow the Spirit of God. And so he was really prepared to go to prison and try to evangelize people in prison. And he was there for, I think he was actually went to prison in December. So he was there for about a month before he got pardoned. And he was really thinking about in his Facebook post, what would happen to me. And because he's sentenced, I think was going to be like 6 months. And I bring this up because it was really interesting to see his posts, because it would veer between, I was wrong, but also I would do it again, And so it was kind of, you never know with these people who, especially with larger conspiracy theories, right? They don't want to give it up, especially if it's religious. At the same time, at some point, it starts to dawn on them that this is not true. So he had to find his way out of that. I don't know if he did.
He's stuck in this quandary somewhere. When we come back in a few minutes, we're going to finish the second half of this conversation with Matthew Bodie. We're going to get into Charlie Kirk, which is something that he is a real specialist in. He's done a lot of research and writing on Charlie Kirk, Turning Point USA, Turning Point Faith, some of the real recent developments in what's happening in TPUSA, how Charlie Kirk has adopted this Seven Mountains mandate, the whole Christian nationalism piece. And then we're going to talk about Project 2025, which if you've been listening to my show, that's something I've done a lot of research, a lot of stuff on Project 2025, the America First Policy Institute. And if you've been paying attention, these are the organizations that are helping to drive a lot of what Trump is doing in office right now. And what I want to ask Matthew is, what we're seeing in the Trump administration is that this Christian nationalist agenda, we haven't seen it overtly declared as yet, but it still could be the driving force behind it. So we're going to get into that as well in the second half. I just wanted to mention what's coming up here next few episodes on the show. I'm working on doing a crossover episode with Lena Sabula. She's the host of the Love and Be Loved podcast. We had a really fascinating discussion the other day, but I think we're going to have to go back and re-record her interview of me. So I'm not sure what's going to happen there. I will keep you posted on that. But I did have a fantastic discussion the other day with Regina Cates. She is the author of the book, The Real Conversation Jesus Wants Us to Have. Now, when I first heard that title, I thought, oh, here we go. We're going to talk to another Christian, someone who's trying to rehabilitate Christianity, but that was absolutely not the case. I had a wonderful conversation with Regina, so that episode is probably going to come out next after this one with Matthew Bodie. And then, speaking of Regina, she is going to be my guest on the next Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom call, which is probably going to be in May. We couldn't get one together for April. I couldn't find anyone who wanted to drop in. I've been really, really busy switching between a couple different jobs at the moment, so I haven't had a lot of time to schedule things, but look forward to that call coming up with Regina. Also, I'm going to mention another piece of news. I've been working really, really hard. I've finished all the narration for my book, Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard, Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. This is available on Amazon, but if you want to wait maybe another month, maybe 2 at the most, I've sent all the recorded chapters over to my editor, Tim Sledge, and he's going to listen through them all now. So we're working our way toward getting that published on Audible. So at long last, I can finally say I have finished. I have done all the narration for my book, which is something I wanted to do since it was released back in September of last year, but I finally had the time to do it. So I will be making an announcement coming up about when that's going to drop on Audible. And I think I'll probably release another chapter or two just to pique people's interest. If you want to go out and buy the Kindle version, you can do that now. If you want to wait for a little bit and pick up the Audible version, that'll be available as well. So I'm looking forward to that coming out because that's really something I wanted to do. Cross it off the bucket list. It's now finally finished. All right, let's get on back into the second half of this conversation with Matthew Bodie, looking at this issue of the Seven Mountains Mandate, the dangerous plan to Christianize America and destroy democracy. Well, I'm interested to get into Charlie Kirk because I had a look at your Medium blog and I thought, okay, I'll read some of these articles. Well, I didn't have a chance because every single one was something about debunking Charlie Kirk on this, debunking Charlie Kirk on that. I thought, okay, this guy's got a serious axe to grind with Charlie Kirk. You mentioned a lot of the impetus behind the book is what Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA are doing. Where does Charlie Kirk come from? If someone's never heard of him or they've maybe heard of TPUSA, can you take us through the backstory? How does a guy like that come to prominence?
So Charlie Kirk started Turning Point as a high school kid, graduating high school in 2012. And, it was this youth outreach organization. He did Tea Party things, which around that time were really growing. But then when Trump came onto the scene in 2016, he really gravitated toward Donald Trump Jr. and started a relationship with him. And from there, it really took off. And it took off in several ways. One, he goes to college campuses and just invites people to come up and question him. And then he makes videos of them not being very good at answering questions. But he also does these really social media provocative things. And he started out with a podcast, and now he has a radio show. So he's really built his platform on being provocative, on I'll put free speech in quotation marks, promoting things that are not necessarily true or misleading. He was very anti-COVID, anti-vax. They ran a big campaign against that. At the same time, he is all in on Trump from 2016 on, and he sees obviously the power of Trump. And so he becomes not just a supporter, but a sycophant, a person who will agree and promote everything that Trump does. And Trump became a regular attender of these Turning Point events. They would have events every semester or so in Florida, and now they have a big headquarters now in Arizona. And these rallies were for college kids, and they have more high school chapters now than they do college chapters. But really, it's branched out into all ages. It's become a parallel political party. It's taken over. It's bested the GOP itself in many ways. What makes Charlie successful is that his youth, his energy, his obviously reaching to young people, but he also knows how to talk to people and get people who are in the congregation in the pews who are older than him, how to remember all the things you have talked about, remember those things, and also see the vision for the future that he wants to do. The last thing I'll say is really what turned him from a secular, promoting secular ideas of democracy, or secular ideas of free speech, or secular ideas of libertarianism. What moved him from that to Christian nationalism was the influence of a megachurch pastor in California named Rob McCoy, who was a Seven Mountains Mandate person. And Rob McCoy came across him at an event and knew the power of his organization and the growth, and really not just encouraged him, but convinced him to take on this new mantra. And he did it at the most opportune time, because in late 2019 was when they kind of got together, and then COVID happened in 2020. And Charlie Kirk could not go to college campuses because they were all closed down. So where did he go? He started doing it at events at churches. So expanding that one audience from college kids, high school kids to churches radically changed everything for him, for Turning Point. And I think that the Calvary Chapel, let's call it denomination, that Rob McCoy is part of, he introduced him to all those types of peoples. He had connections into the Southern Baptist. And so you have charismatics as well with the Trump advisory board. So you have three large audiences now that Charlie Kirk is going to. The last thing about Charlie is that he has a radio show. And so many people have compared him to Rush Limbaugh, the famous conservative radio host. He is very, we'll say, argumentative or very powerful in what he does on the radio show. And then, of course, I will add that Turning Point is not just an American group anymore. It tried to start a branch in Canada first. That failed, but now there is a growing group of Turning Point UK and Turning Point Australia.
Yeah, I read your article about that. I was surprised to hear that because I didn't realize we had a Turning Point UK and there was a Turning Point in Australia. Both of them, as you say, have struggled to kind of get off the ground. It's very different here. I'm in the UK. It's really, really different than the American scene as far as evangelical involvement in politics. There's a tiny movement. And I could see when I read your article, I thought, okay, I can see why Turning Point UK has had some problems. Same with the Australian branch. There was a long-standing organization called Turning Point in both countries. I think it was like a drug rehabilitation program. So that immediately there was a problem. Like, wait, are you part of the Turning Point drug rehab thing? What? So there was an identity problem that they didn't have in the United States. So they have struggled to get off the ground in those two countries, haven't they?
Yeah, no, yeah. I think the main thing about the Turning Point UK, which I think maybe they kind of refer to themselves as TP UK now, just to get away from that, is the religious element of it. They obviously wanted England to return to its religious roots and its Christian roots, but they're merely much more, and Charlie Kirk is a very anti-immigrant, but TP UK is even that on steroids. And so their main issue has been doing rallies and marches against immigrants and in immigrant communities and tagging along to other people that are doing similar things. They might not have the biggest numbers, but they are gravitating toward the same type of people that are causing, lots of havoc in the UK, from my understanding.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got far right parties. Obviously, you guys like Nigel Farage, British National Party, the BNP, and some of these other really hard right. And they were instrumental in helping get Brexit passed. Because I was living here when Brexit was coming up for the vote. And of course, we could see kind of what was going on. It was empowered by this anti-immigrant bias and all the rest of it. And they're saying if Turkey is allowed to join the EU, then they're going to flood the country with millions of illegal immigrants. So they're going to take your jobs. And you could see the fear mongering and all that. So it was an interesting thing. But I was interested to talk about, okay, so you mentioned Charlie Kirk. He didn't originally start out, he wasn't a Christian nationalist then. It sounds like what you're saying. It was more
Oh, yeah, correct.
a secular thing, political thing. He wasn't getting into the religious aspect of it much. It was more about quote unquote free speech and all that. So some of the articles I've read, it seems to suggest that he kind of bolted on the Christian nationalist piece, maybe the Seven Mountains piece. And I don't know how cynical we can be about this, but it seems like he was viewing it as, hey, this is a great avenue by which I can get into a whole new huge audience. What's your take on it? Because is he a quote unquote Christian? Is Charlie Kirk a Christian? Is he promoting Christianity, the gospel, or whatever that means? Or is he just cynically adopting this, saying, hey, I can get in here and that's going to get me access to millions of people?
I think it's both. I think he's always presented himself as a Christian, as an evangelical. He was part of a mega church in Chicago where he grew up as a high school person. And he lived kind of there on and off as Turning Point grew. And he was involved with an evangelical church there and often repeated or tweeted things that they were saying. So that was certainly the case. When he met Rob McCoy, it became Christian nationalism. And I don't think Rob McCoy would use that term, but Charlie does describe himself as a Christian and as a nationalist. So I will use those two terms together. And I think, though, people ask me, does Charlie really believe all this stuff? I think he does. At the same time, I also think he saw it as a tremendous business opportunity. I think Rob McCoy probably presented it to him as both, right? That you're wrong on this, not promoting religion through your work. Charlie Kirk's famously saying in 2018, right, that I don't mix my religion and politics. By the next year, yeah.
He's absolutely mixing both.
Yeah.
There's no line anymore.
Right. I think that he saw the ways to expand Turning Point and also saw it didn't take much for him to make. I describe it as a 180 because theologically it is, but at the same time, it didn't take much for him to make this turn. It really was about, I have an interest in politics and I have an interest in religion. I need to put them together. But at the same time, it did take Rob McCoy to push him to do that.
What's your concern about the Christian nationalist piece? I mean, maybe you could define that for the listener, someone who says, well, what actually is Christian nationalism? Why is Charlie Kirk's embracing of it along with the Seven Mountains Mandate? Why is that such a concern? Or should I be concerned?
I think you should be concerned, yes. My basic definition of Christian nationalism is that your country, in this case, America, my country, the Christian nationalism wants it to be a Christian nation. And that means, one, that we should accept it as a Christian and having a Christian past, and not just generalized Christianity. We're talking about a Protestant evangelical Christianity, where Charlie Kirk says, erroneously, that 51 out of the 55 signers of the Declaration of Independence were Bible-believing Christians.
Yeah, and evangelicals.
Right. if they were all part of the same church or something. So then what that means now in present days, that when they say that America should be a Christian nation, it should not just be ruled by Christians, they should be elected to office, but that any of these 7 areas should be Christian. That our public schools should be, in some areas, promoting the state church of Christianity. If you're talking about media and culture and entertainment, it's a little bit harder to distinguish what it is they want to do, but basically they want to erase voices that are not in line with that and promote their own. So they're not just out there to mock the other side or to scream about mainstream media and conspiracy theories. They want to end those things and have their own, there. So if you talk about Fox News as a parallel universe, what Turning Point wants to do, and it's obviously much smaller than Fox News, is to create content and media that pushes out the other voices. So if you think about the mountain of family, they obviously want the government and society to promote and to put in place primarily the traditional Christian family, and anything that does not match that would be out of bounds. So we're talking about dissolution of types of marriages that are illegal right now. But we're also talking about ways in which we don't really know. We don't really know how far Charlie Kirk is willing to go. I mean, is he a Rush Jr.? Would we have these great tomes of writing of what we're specifically going to do with the 10 Commandments? No, he's not like that. But at the same time, Trump will do Project 2025, which is a list of how to dismantle every single government agency. And that's one of the 7 mountains. So if you think about what it means to make a Christian nation, there's not really sure of, in which area you could go. You can name a bunch of different areas. But at the same time, it is not about mass evangelism and making the entire nation or a majority of the nation Christians. It is about ruling as a minority. So that has very clear implications for religious liberty and for other religions, other non-Protestant Christianities. And I think that it's about not just quieting those voices or erasing those voices or ending those voices. It could also be about promoting a Douglas Wilson type of community where perhaps women don't have the right to vote because they're voting by household. Now, there's some disagreement. Turning Point has not gone that far yet. But at the same time, you add the idea that the government in America is being ruled by not just Democrats, but by evil people, or not just secularists or not just communists, but people that God doesn't like. There is a violent aspect of what they want to do. And now that they're in power, they're really promoting that each and every day. And it is unknown how far they're willing to go, but a Christian nationalism to me is simply a definition of having your nation be defined as a Christian nation, both in the past and in the present and in the future.
Yeah, we were once a Christian nation. We've strayed from the path. We got to get back to that again. You mentioned Project 2025. Now, I did a lot of episodes on Project 2025 toward the end of last year, running up to the election. Unfortunately, I was warning people, hey, you don't elect this guy. He's going to enact policies like Project 2025. And then we found out there was the America First Policy Institute, which is another real Christian nationalist organization that once he kind of disavowed himself from Project 2025, AFPI kind of slid in there, and they're in some ways even more draconian than Project 2025. Would you say, you kind of alluded to this, could you expand on this? Okay, what Trump is actually doing right now. You're the first person I've talked to since the election who's an expert on this kind of thing. What he's doing right now, trying to dismantle the federal government, having trade wars with Canada and Mexico, all the things he's doing, are these part and parcel of the policies of things like AFPI and Project 2025? Or is Trump just going out on his own? Because I haven't heard anything about evangelicals other than people like Russ Vought, who was instrumental in AFPI. He's now the head of the office of budget and management and all that kind of thing. So he controls the purse strings. He can turn the taps off and shut down funding for any number of organizations. I mean, what's Trump doing? Is he actually enacting these Christian
Yes.
nationalist policies?
Yes, all those things.
And more?
I mean, I think that the 2 main ones, of course, are immigration and education. So, closing down the border, deporting people that for various reasons support things that President Trump doesn't support. But we're also talking about deporting large swaths of people that are not Protestant. And in terms of education, he's specifically targeted higher education by defunding it through taking away the grant funding, but also then removing the DEI funding. He's threatened particular universities were removing millions of dollars of federal funding. And at the same time, in terms of K through 12 or primary education, these local school boards and state boards of education are seeing that happen and saying, we're going to do it at our state level. There's several states now that are instituting their own Doge, their own Elon Musk version of this. We just want to cut everything. Now they're going to do it in a little different way. In Georgia, here in my state, they're talking about vaccine regulations, but they're doing those things at the state level because they see them happening at the federal level. So beyond immigration and education, you have, of course, just massive layoffs that I laugh because it's so terrible of the federal government. You had people trying to end the Department of Education, but you also have massive layoffs at all the agencies. And that's a Project 2025 thing. In terms of making them the nation more Christian, if you think about whether you think Trump is a Christian, I don't think so, but he is promoting these ideas. We have a new Trump Evangelical Advisory Board. Paula White Cain is back. We have, prayers happening in different ways. We have people, they're not recognizing specifically religious holidays. And I think that the Christian part is not quite ramped up yet, but the people that are supporting the things that he's doing are evangelical Christians. Their, impact of these events probably hasn't hit them. Perhaps farmers are being hit, but not necessarily everybody else. So it will be interesting to see the thing that I'm going to tomorrow, this pastor summit. So it's probably about 1,000 pastors from around the Southeast here coming into Gainesville to hear from Charlie Kirk. And my question that I want to hear him and other people answer is, what do you say to these people now that you've won? How do you keep them involved and keep them willing to do the things you want to do now that you've won? Because, you've won. So how do they act, or what you ask them to do? And I think one of the things he's going to say is you should be more political now from the pulpit. They said that before, during the Biden administration, but it was really about defying the government and defining COVID policies. But now that we have this moment, you should step out and say these things, not just endorsing candidates, but we're talking about spreading this morality in a different way than it was before. Obviously, preachers and pastors have talked about moral issues for the pulpit for many years, but tying it to a specific political agenda, specifically Project 2025 and the Trump administration, that will be, I think, what he's going to say is that this is the moment that God has put Trump into office and you should come with us.
And that was what I was trying to warn people. I don't know how many people listened to my podcast before the election. Obviously not enough to vote, for Kamala Harris. But these things are pretty scary, because I kept saying what's going to be different if Trump were to win is it's not going to be the shambolic presidency of his first tenure.
No.
He's not going to walk in there. He didn't know what he was doing. It was a chaotic mess for months and maybe the whole 4 years. I don't know. This time it's going to be different. And I was absolutely right. I should be a prophet, Matthew. I should be a.
Well, it didn't take a whole prophet train to see what was going to happen. But
yeah, the Holy Spirit wasn't on me. I could see that coming. And that was where I was reading things like AFPI and Project 2025, and they were training up this sort of huge cadre of people, loyalists who were going to be coming straight in on day one. They had this 180-day playbook and all this other stuff that we're going to hit it on day one. And we've seen that. That's the difference between the last time and this time. And I was thinking you were talking about Project 2025, a couple of the other draconian things, talking about outlawing pornography and making abortion more draconian, more illegal, doing away with, mail order, quote unquote, mail order abortion. So these are the things that Christian nationalists are trying to do. They're saying, look, you put us in charge now. We're going to start making these things illegal and make it more difficult to get access to certain things, like you say, annulling LGBTQ rights and trans rights and same-sex marriage and all that. They're just going to make them illegal. So that seems to be the agenda.
Is the way in which they're doing all these things is by executive order. This a power, a presidency that we have not seen before. And so the executive order here thing, you'd be surprised the things you just listed. He hasn't quite mentioned those things in executive orders. Maybe they'll come later, but the executive orders is really the key here, and the divine mandate behind it. Again, God put Trump in the office to do the things, and therefore he doesn't need the other institutions of government to do it.
Right. Well, I'm aware of the time. I know we've been talking a little bit longer. We said about 45 minutes. I've got a lot more questions for you, but I don't want to keep you too long. You have a book, though. It's coming out, looks like on Amazon. It says September the 30th, 2025. It is called, again, The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy, by Matthew Bodie. So people can pre-order that. I was going to say, too, if you're interested, I would love to have you come back. We do these Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom calls once a month. I think people would really enjoy talking to you, getting your perspective, especially in these trying times. So if you're interested in that, I can hit you up maybe some possible dates, and we could look at doing that.
Sure. Like I said, the book does come out. I know that, I'm working on the final edits now. I'd publisher Westminster John Knox Press out of Kentucky here in the United States. Would love to have people buy it.
Okay, great. And then one last question before I let you go. How can people find you on social media if they want to connect with you? What's the best way?
I'm on Twitter at Matthew Bodie, MatthewBoedy. I'm on Blue Sky under the same name, but I just kind of started there, so not as big. But I usually use X or Twitter.
That's the best way. Okay, so thank you, Matthew. I hope people will buy this book or at least pre-order it. If you're interested, I'd love to have you come back on the show so we can talk about that maybe off air. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and you have a good day.
Bye.